If you're the owner of a 2015 and newer F-150 and you're looking to level your truck using some very high quality components, then look no further than the Eibach Pro Truck front shock that we're talking about here today. Now, when installed, this kit will provide truck owners with the option of going anywhere from 0 to 2 inches of additional front end lift thanks to the snap ring and collar design. Now, these things will be sold individually for just over $100 per side, and the site's going to call this a strong 1 out of 3 wrenches on the difficulty meter. I think that might be underselling this job just a little bit, but either way, leave yourself an hour or two in the garage per side and hang with me till the end of the video and we'll show you how it's done. Now, traditionally, when we talk leveling kits, truck owners have a couple of options. The more affordable way is no doubt to use a puck-style spacer on top of your factory suspension or strut assembly to get that desired front end lift or level. Now, these, again, are going to be a cost-effective way to achieve more front end height and fit a bigger wheel and tire at the end of the day, but that's pretty much it. They don't offer really any other benefits outside of that level or lift. Then you have something like this, which is a completely new front shock, and it will offer a few selectable levels of height adjustment for the front end to customize just how high you want this thing to sit, from stock ride height essentially using the lower slot here, all the way up to 2 inches using the top slot. Now, in order to change that ride height, Eibach utilizes a snap ring, and that's going to help seat the spring perch or collar on the shock body itself here using the grooves and, again, that snap ring. Now, you can set this ride height. They come preset for 1.5 inches of front end lift or level, but if you have a snap ring plier, you can obviously change that prior to the installation, and I would highly recommend doing that prior to the installation, because once everything is installed on your F-150 at home, making front end height adjustments is not going to be easy without removing these and then kind of going back through the process all over again. It's certainly not like a coilover where you can bust out a spanner wrench, rotate your collars, and tweak your height that way. Instead, a little bit more involved, but if you're a set it and forget it type of owner, these are certainly going to be worth a look. Now, it also bears mentioning the fact that you can use these shocks from Eibach with pretty much any spring for your 2015 and newer F-150, including the stock spring, of course, or you could even check out Eibach's matching spring they offer for this particular gen truck. Now, as for the shock itself, it's going to feature a monotube design that is loaded with a 46mm piston along with that nitrogen charge that will admittedly firm things up a bit on the road in regards to ride quality, but will also offer far more stability and control both on and off-road, help limit some of that body roll, and basically give you more control off-road, especially in those higher speed situations. Now, this is also a great time to mention the really nice or glowing reviews on the Eibach dampers themselves here on the site. So as always, feel free to check those out on the product page if you haven't already done so. A great way to get some real-world feedback from F-150 owners who have actually installed this thing and are out there pounding the pavement, or dirt in this case. But now we want to show you just what it takes to get everything installed on your F-150 at home, and to do so, here's a detailed walkthrough for you guys along with a quick tool breakdown. Check it out.
Tools used for this install are an impact gun or ratchet, 19mm wrench, 18mm wrench, 13mm wrench, 8mm wrench, 21mm socket, 19mm socket, 18mm socket, 13mm socket, 10mm socket, 8mm socket, 5mm Allen, a pair of vice grips, hand actuated vacuum pump, a dead blow hammer, a torque wrench, and a pry bar. So the first step of this install is going to be to get your vehicle up in the air, supported either on a lift or jack stands, and then you're going to want to remove the front wheels so that you can gain access to all the suspension parts. So now that I have my wheel pulled off, I'm going to start by removing my caliper and my rotor from the knuckle. I'm going to start by unbolting the brake line from the knuckle so that I have a little bit more leeway with the caliper, and then I'll pull that off, hang it off to the side, and remove my rotor. I'm going to use a 10mm socket to unbolt the brake line, and then a 21mm socket to unbolt the caliper. So next I'm going to remove the brake rotor dust shield, and this isn't 100% necessary, but I'm going to be removing the entire knuckle assembly, and I just want to make sure that this doesn't get damaged in the process, and it's only held on with 3 bolts. So I'm going to pop these out, remove the dust shield, and keep moving. So the next thing I'm going to do is remove my wheel speed sensor here from the knuckle. I'm going to use an 8mm socket to remove the bolt that holds the line to the knuckle assembly, and then a 5mm Allen that holds the wheel speed sensor into the hub. So now I'm going to start unbolting my outer tie rod end and my ball joints upper and lower. I'm going to loosen the bolts for the lower ball joint and the upper ball joint, but I'm not going to fully remove them until I'm ready to pull my whole hub assembly out. I'm going to use a 21mm socket for the outer tie rod and lower ball joint and an 18mm socket for the upper. All right, so I'm pretty much ready to disconnect my upper ball joint, and what I'm gonna do is use a pry bar and hook it into my coil spring, push down on my lower control arm to take tension off of the upper ball joint and remove the nut. And then I can slowly release the tension on the upper control arm. The next thing I'm going to do is disconnect the vacuum hose that runs to the back of the IWE actuator for the knuckle. This is for the 4-wheel drive system. And then I'm going to remove the center cap for the axle nut. So now I can attach my hand actuated vacuum pump to the back of the hose that I just removed. There's a large port on the back of the hub, and I'll just plug this hose into that, and then I can pull this to 24 inches of vacuum. And by pulling 24 inches of vacuum, I'm disengaging the 4-wheel drive actuator on the hub. And now I can remove the axle nut, remove my lower control arm nut, and pull my knuckle assembly out. Now I'm going to remove the 13mm nut for the axle, remove my lower control arm, my lower ball joint nut, and remove the hub assembly all as one. So now that I have my knuckle assembly out of the way, I have full access to remove my strut without causing any damage to the axle or the IWE actuator for the 4-wheel drive. The next thing I'm going to do is use an 18mm socket to disconnect my sway bar end link, as well as the 2 nuts on the bottom of the strut, and then I'll work on unbolting the top of the strut and removing the whole thing out of the truck. So the final step of taking the strut assembly out of the car is to remove the 3 18mm nuts located at the top of the strut. So I'm going to use my 18mm ratcheting wrench, and I'm going to remove those nuts and then pull the strut assembly out. So now that you have everything removed, you can just pull the strut assembly right out of the truck. So the next step of this install is going to require to use a spring compressor. I have our strut assembly mounted up in the spring compressor, and I have the top hooks hooked onto the strut top itself. I'm going to compress the spring, remove the nut for the strut assembly, and disassemble the entire thing. I'm going to use a 17mm socket on my impact gun with a universal joint just to get to the top, and we'll spin this thing off. So the next thing we have to do now that we have our strut assembly taken apart is we have to harvest the spring perch off of the factory strut. And in order to do that, we'll have to spray this down with some rust penetrant, pop the cap loose by just tapping on it with a hammer, and also remove this cap so that we can remove the entire spring perch from the shock. We are going to reuse our bump stop, so I'm going to make sure to save that. Now I can just take off the cap and the spring perch, and we're ready to install it onto our new strut. So now we're ready to install our lower spring perch onto our new shock. I have this set at the highest 2-inch lift setting. However, if you want it to go anywhere between stock and the 2-inch, all you have to do is move the C-clip and set it into one of these 4 ridges, and then all you can do is put your spring perch on for your desired ride height. So now we're ready to install our new shock into our spring and complete our strut assembly. I'm just going to install our bump stop onto the strut shaft and slide it into place. Now I'm just going to use a pair of vice grips to hold the top of the strut shaft and a 19mm wrench to tighten down the hardware. Now that I have my hardware tightened up, I can decompress my spring slowly and reinstall it onto the vehicle. So now we're ready to install our strut back into our vehicle. I'm going to just start the top hardware at the top of the strut, and then I'll line up the bottom bolts that are provided with the kit. And now I can install the provided hardware at the bottom of the strut into the lower control arm. So now I'm just going to use a 19mm socket and wrench and tighten up the lower bolts and then move my way back up to the top and tighten those down. So now I'm going to take my ratcheting wrench again and I'm going to tighten up the hardware for the top of the strut, and then I'll reassemble my knuckles. So now I'm ready to reinstall my knuckle. I have 24 inches of vacuum pulled on my IWE actuator so that I disengage the four-wheel drive splines. That way I don't damage anything when I'm putting the axle back through the hub, and I'll just get all my bolt holes lined up and slide it into place. Now I'm just going to use my 13mm socket to lightly tighten up the axle nut, and then I'm going to torque it to spec when I'm done. Now you can disengage your vacuum and unhook your vacuum pump. So now that I have everything loosely in place, I'm going to reinstall my outer tie rod end into my knuckle, get the nut started, and then I'm going to tighten up this ball joint, the lower ball joint, and then I'll move on to the upper control arm. So now I'm going to use a floor jack to slowly compress the spring and lift the knuckle assembly up to meet the upper ball joint so that I can get the nut started and tighten that down. So now I'm going to use an 18mm ratcheting wrench to tighten up the upper ball joint nut, and I'm also going to use an 8mm socket to hold the shaft of the upper ball joints to keep it from spinning while I tighten it down. So now I'm going to use a torque wrench and I'm going to tighten down the axle nut to 35 foot-pounds. I'm going to use my pry bar to hold everything from spinning, and then I'll tighten it up. And now I can reinstall my dust cap. Before I can reinstall the dust shield for my brake rotor, I'm going to reinstall my ABS wheel speed sensor wire into the hub, and then tighten that up with the 5mm Allen, and then the line retainer on the side of the knuckle with my 8mm socket. Now I can reinstall my dust shield. Now I can reinstall my rotor, and I'm going to use a lug nut to hold this in place while I reinstall my caliper. And then I can hang my caliper back into place. And reinstall the hardware. So now I can tighten up my caliper bolts with my 21mm socket. I can also tighten up my brake line retainer on the knuckle with my 10mm socket. Reattach my vacuum line here on the back of the hub. And reinstall my nut for my sway bar end link. And I'll tighten that down with my 18mm ratcheting wrench. And that's going to wrap up this review and install of the Eibach Pro Truck Sport Front Shock for a 0 to 2 inch lift fitting your 2015 to 2019 F-150 with 4-wheel drive. Thanks for watching, and for all things F-150, keep it right here at AmericanTrucks.com.